Alrighty, so good evening. Welcome to the final Fish Tales for 2022. I'm Gab Watling, the 2022 storyteller-in-residence, and I am your MC for the evening. I won't be telling a story myself, but I will be happily introducing all of our storytellers. The theme for tonight's show is ancestors. We all have ancestors. And we know this because they leave their stories behind after they have physically left us. We exist, in effect, at the intersection of our own and our ancestors' stories. At the end of the show tonight, I will become one of Fishtail's ancestors, as I hand over the ceremonial fish hook to Heidi Wakeman, who will be our next storyteller-in-residence. And as Heidi is our first storyteller this evening, let me tell you a little bit about her. Heidi Wakeman has been writing and evaluating since the 5th grade, when each day in her diary received a letter grade. These days, she is less interested in grading and more interested in gratitude. Heidi is an educator, poet, naturalist, community activist, Gen X feminist, mother, wife, recovering perfectionist. Her pandemic quote is, "Let's not waste a good crisis."
Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, what a thrill to be here at Gloucester Stage Company. Thank you for showing up, and here's my story. This is a story about fact, fiction, American history, and the power of poetry. My name is Heidi Wakeman, Heidi Elizabeth Wakeman. My mother's name is Margaret Prescott Wakeman. My brother's name is Thomas Prescott Wakeman. My son's name is Owen Prescott Wakeman Bryan. My sister's cat's name is Prescott, and there's even a town in the center of Massachusetts named Prescott, but currently it's under thousands of gallons of water, the Quabbin Reservoir. So Prescott's a pretty good name. Prescott is the namesake of my ancestor, the world-famous, American-famous, Revolutionary War activist, Dr. Samuel Prescott. Yeah. Listen, children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Samuel Prescott. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of... So my ancestor, Dr. Samuel Prescott, was one of 3 riders that fateful night, April 18th, 1775. Imagine, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, perhaps 12:30, perhaps 1:30. Young Dr. Prescott, 24 years old, is at the home of his beloved Lydia Milken. He leaves the house and he hears some horses coming. Who could it be? Well, there's 2 riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes. The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. It's true, it's true. Thousands of British soldiers had amassed at Boston and were about to come to Concord. Perhaps you know this story. Young Dr. Prescott mounted his horse and joined the group. The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. They rode from Lexington, 6 miles from Lexington on their way to Concord. They rode, the regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. And then they were caught. Well, one of them was caught. Paul Revere was caught. There's a monument to him in Lexington for being caught by the British. On William Dawes went. On Samuel Prescott went. The regulars are coming. The regulars are coming. William Dawes got on his horse, still on his horse. He's running, leaping over a wall, and he stumbled, and he fell. William Dawes did not make the rest of the trip. My ancestor, Dr. Samuel Prescott, was the one of those 3 riders that made that ride. Thank you. And so, as you know, the militia were alerted, and on the morning of April 19th, there was the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Concord, and really the start of our American country as we know today. I'm very proud of this, but why don't you know about this? 3 words: Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In 1861, Longfellow was charged with writing a poem to illustrate some form or part of American history. And he thought, wow, this is a pretty good story. Midnight ride, there's horses, there's revolution, ordinary people doing amazing things. What rhymes with Prescott? Dawes, not much better. Revere, well, wouldn't you know it? This poem has become part of American history. It has become part of how people learn and know, or think they know, about American history. My ancestor, Dr. Samuel Prescott, I've since learned, not only didn't get a memorial here, did not get a poem. He served as a surgeon in Ticonderoga the following year. He was arrested by the British in the following year, after that, at the age of 26, where he died in a Halifax prison. He never had children. He was not a fiancé to young Lydia Milliken. Some of these stories we hear are just not true. He was a namesake of the Prescott family, so perhaps he's an eccentric great uncle, perhaps a cousin. I do like claiming him because as a revolutionary loudmouth, I like to say that maybe I got some of his DNA. So in closing, I just would like to say 3 things. 1, history is made of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. 2, history is not always true. And 3, to all my writer friends out there, never underestimate the power of a poem. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Heidi. I feel sure your ancestor would have got a park outside, though, instead of having his license plate called out. And anyway, okay, so our next storyteller is a dear friend of mine, a colleague, Larry Volk from Endicott College. Larry is a visual artist and educator working in a variety of still and motion-based media. His work has been exhibited regionally and nationally with a focus on family history, biography, and narrative. He was an obvious choice for this evening. Thank you, Larry.
Thanks, Gab. Thanks, everyone, for letting me tell my story. My daughter will have her bat mitzvah this spring. And like any... Thank you, Hugo. My daughter will have her bat mitzvah this spring. And like any 12-year-old, she feels pretty challenged by the amount of Hebrew she has to learn for her Torah portion. And when she's most vexed by this, she'll turn to me and say, well, you never had a bar mitzvah. Why do I have to do this? And she's right. I never had a bar mitzvah. I grew up in suburban Cleveland in a pretty typical Jewish family, but we weren't exactly like all Jewish families. I was surrounded by war brides, and in particular my mother, who was a Cuban national raised in France and who was imprisoned during the occupation in France in Vittel. And while she didn't identify herself as a Holocaust survivor, she certainly was, but she rarely talked about it. So as a 12-year-old, you can imagine a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah is a pretty significant thing given my mother's history, but at the same time, the thing that made it so significant, we really couldn't talk about. And so, growing up, my mother tried to be a regular American housewife. She became a naturalized US citizen. She drove a station wagon. She served my brother TV dinners. And yet, she wasn't a typical American housewife. Her heavy French accent was indecipherable to my friends. And when they'd come and stay for dinner, she would ask them, boys, would you like to have some chicken from the Colonel? And they'd turn to me, and I would have to explain, well, that's Colonel Sanders' Kentucky Fried Chicken. So there weren't many clues to my mother's history in the house. The few photographs that I had of her would depict her on a stage with a bunch of other younger women in theatricals. That's not a Holocaust story. And I'd find clues in the house, a small envelope, and inside a yellow Jewish star with the word Juif inscribed upon it. And my mother would tell me, well, that was the star my sister had to wear. And yet, when we went to Paris, it was the city of light. It was wonderful. There was no discussion of the occupation or the war. And at the same time, my mother would sometimes allude to a story that her whole family piled in the car and tried to flee Paris and escape the Germans, only to realize that there was no place to go. So they returned to Paris, and my mother would say, and that's when they started picking up the Jews. And eventually they came for her. German soldiers came to my grandparents' apartment at 35 Rue Saint-Sébastien in the 11th arrondissement. They knocked on the door, and they took my mother and her brother away, and they sent my mother to Vittel. And so after a while, I realized that my mother would probably never really share the entire story with me, and I would never really betray her silence. But at times, such as Passover, we would recite the story of the ancient Jews' exodus from Egypt, and I would listen to the 4 questions, and I wasn't interested in the 4 questions of the ancient Jews. I was interested in questions about my mother. What happened to her? How did she survive? Why can't she tell me the story? Why did you live if they knew you were a Jew? And so at a certain point, I realized that my mother would not tell me this. And then when she passed in 2003, I felt like I could pick up the story again. And so I started to research as an artist. I started to unravel the story. The story was like a tangled thread that I kept pulling on. And I started to learn. And the reason my mother survived was that she held a Cuban passport, because she never naturalized as a French citizen. My grandfather insisted on that. And that saved her because she was more valuable as an asset for prisoner exchange. And so she was sent to Vittel with other residents from allied nations, such as British citizens. And eventually I started to unravel the story, and a British man contacted me. He was living in Paris and he was researching the camp. And he could tell me much more about the history of the camp and what happened there. And I went to Vittel, and I saw the building where my mother was housed. And I learned about the gymnasium in the 11th arrondissement, where they brought the Jews before they sent them to the transit camps. And I learned that over 1,500 school children in her neighborhood had been killed. But that still wasn't enough. I didn't really understand what had happened to her. What was it like? What did she carry with her? And when I was in this apartment of this British man, Jimmy Fox, and he was telling me about the history of Vittel, he told me that he knew of a woman in Montreal, not far from Boston. And he thought that maybe she could tell me more about the camp. She'd been interned there as well. And he suggested to me that I look through his emails to find her contact information. And as I did that, something really remarkable happened. As I was looking through the email, I saw one, and written upon it was, my best friend at the camp was named Rosette. She was a Cuban national. And I turned to Jimmy and I said, that has to be my mother. And sure enough, it was. She was my mother's best friend. Her name was Zena Woods. And she could tell me what it was like, how she felt, what they understood about being able to go to Vittel and perhaps live. And finally, I was able to unravel this story, unravel this thread about my lineage. And so this year, I realized I had one more thing I needed to do. And when my daughter Ava steps up on the bima for her bat mitzvah, I will hand her that thread, and she will carry it forward wherever she may go. Thank you.
And that is the story that Ava will carry for the rest of her life. And that is why we are here. Okay. Our next storyteller is Hilary Robinson. Hilary is a sociologist and legal theorist, born and raised in Washington, D.C. by an interracial couple during the years where that was still unusual. She has spent much of her adult life figuring out how to be herself while being biracial in different settings, including the Northeast, Northeast US, Denmark, and Switzerland. Hilary is also the outgoing Vice President of the North Shore branch of the NAACP, which she helped found in 2020 in response to the murder of George Floyd. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you for the warm welcome. Join the NAACP. We have our outgoing president in the audience, too, Natalie. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family by walking you through some photos, some family photos. But I wanted to start by reading some lyrics from To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which is a song written by Nina Simone for her friend Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun and died tragically of, I think, ovarian cancer in her early 30s. Young, gifted, and black. Oh, what a lovely, precious dream. To be young, gifted, and black. Open your heart to what I mean. You are young, gifted, and black. We must begin to tell our young. There's a world waiting for you. Yours is the quest that's just begun. So these are members of my family. They're at school here in Virginia in a time period where the education that was available to people of color in the United States was mostly agricultural and service education. This is a school in Virginia called St. Francis that educated my great-great-grandmother to become a domestic servant in the homes of people who weren't of color in that mid-Atlantic region of the United States. So we'll just run you through a couple slides next. So this is on the left, or on the right-hand side behind me, is our first ancestor who was born out of enslavement. She is my great-great-great-grandmother. My grandmother is in the middle. She's graduating from school, or she's in school in this photo at St. Francis. And her mother is on the left-hand side. So I want you to just start to pay attention to color tones, which is why I'm basing the talk around visuals. And I'm standing here before you. Next slide, please. That's my mom. She was here for Thanksgiving, and a lot of people in the room met her just last week. Next slide. And on the left-hand side is my grandmother, who you saw in the photo. Her name is Patricia. This is her in the 1940s, and that's the left. She is wearing a skirt and a midriff, and just owning her world there in Washington, D.C. On the right-hand side is my grandfather. He was born in the 1890s and shoveled coal into the railroad in Troy, New York, that was a part of a line that went between Troy and Vermont and Maine. And my mother used to tell a kind of joke about my father marrying up when he married her, because her family was educated for, I think I'm the 5th generation of like private girls' school education stemming from those St. Francis days. And I thought about it when I was preparing for this talk, like, what is it that makes that a joke? And I realized sort of uncomfortably that the twist is that you wouldn't expect black people to be the people who were the more educated in a black-white pairing like my parents, who are in the middle there with me in 1982. Next slide. So obviously education was really highly valued in my family. You can just advance. I'll just give you signals. That's, me in girls' school, a long tradition. Next slide. Or that's graduation from Harvard in 2003. MIT in 2017. Teaching at Northeastern Law School, and my dream job started in 2018. And yep, there you go. Next slide. And that helped me to really fulfill a family legacy, which is that of my father, who died in 1994 when I was 11. He was the first Professor Robinson. I actually submitted my dissertation, so close the loop on that sort of family dream. But I got to Northeastern in 2018, and I became profoundly depressed. So I had done everything that I wanted to do and fulfilled a lot of the really important values of my family, primarily centered around education, but found that I just couldn't find my way forward with the identity that I had, which was, a professor person in Boston with a great job. And in order to make my way forward in my life, I had to go back. So if you could hit the slide like a couple of times. way back. One more. To these people. So my mom didn't talk about being Black really at all. Her mother died when she was 2 in childbirth, and she was raised by my great-grandmother, who is on the left-hand side there, and that's a photo of her getting married in the teens, the late teens. And what by now you've maybe recognized, and what I did recognize when I did a kind of therapy for depression that involves taking psychedelics, which can unearth like knowledges and old trauma that you're not even really aware that you have. What I understood at that point was, it sort of came to me in a dissociated moment, that my mother's life was bookended by 2 half-white women, myself and her grandmother who raised her after her mother died. And the story about how my great-grandmother was half-white was something that at 40 years old, I didn't know how to explain. I had no knowledge of the family history that would have led to that, like so many people of color in the United States, where kind of Black history is white history, in that it often traces back to these kinds of interracial pairings that happened a long time ago. So the kind of discoveries that I made by talking to the few members of the Black side of my family that I knew really indicated to me the great strength that there was in the family itself. I just, recognized in part that when we hide histories, which ties me to my colleague who just spoke, that we don't recognize how we may be carrying, massive difficulties into our own life. As a friend who's in the room said, the battle for identity is really hard won, and you can't get it from the outside in. You have to get it from the inside out. So I had all of these credentials and had arrived in this wonderful place in my life by a lot of external measures. But I fundamentally didn't know who I was. Just to give you some context, in 1964, roughly 40 years before I started at MIT, there were fewer than 20 Black students in all of MIT. In 1986, when the Challenger blew up, there was a MIT PhD student, a graduate, person of color. He was the second Black astronaut to be in space in 1986. In 1977, when my parents married, it was just a short decade after their marriage would have been illegal in a third of American states. So in 1967, Loving v. Virginia was the Supreme Court case that made anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional. So understanding that as we move, looking like we do through spaces that have those kinds of histories, that no matter how many degrees we have or how attractive we are or healthy, that we are carrying those kinds of histories with us was really, really important for me being able to kind of unburden myself and move forward. So I wanted to just bring up 2 things in that regard. One sort of funny story that because my mother was raised by someone who was born in 1896, for many, many years she continued to send me white gloves. Every year, these are the calfskin ones that you wear when it's cold out. These are the cotton ones that you wear on Easter if it's warm. These are the long ones that you wear when you're going to a formal event. And she would send them repeatedly just to make sure if I had sullied the other ones for the functions that I didn't go to. Which would just be another example of, acquiring sort of proper manners or aspirational whiteness, which as law professor Cheryl Harris said in her article, Whiteness as Property, it is a transactional thing. My mother wasn't wrong in kind of minimizing our Black history and elevating me as an educated person to go forward into the world, but it isn't enough. I brought this book by Eldridge Cleaver as I just sum up. It's called Soul on Ice. And it was a way that Cleaver and others have preceded him, like Du Bois, talked about what it's like to be Black in America. When George Floyd was murdered in 2020, and we started then ACP here on the North Shore, Doc Rivers won a game, I think he won, the Celtics coach, and was asked in a press conference what he thought about what had happened in Minneapolis. And he started to cry, and he said, Black people have loved this country, and the problem is that it hasn't loved us back. So Eldridge Cleaver, Soul on Ice. Here's the last stanza of the poem that Nina Simone wrote. When you're feeling real low, yeah, there's a great truth that you should know. When you're young, gifted, and Black, your soul's intact. Thank you.
This is powerful stuff. I knew when I chose this topic that we were going to hear some tremendously powerful stories tonight. Okay, our next storyteller is beloved, local, Brian Orr, pediatrician who probably has connected with many of you over the years. He is a Fishtails veteran. He knows more about this than I do. He is also an author and an artist, and he's working on a story for the stage that he hopes to be able to present to the community in the near future. But between now and then, here he is.
This is my Irish cap, and I love my Irish cap. It fits really well. It is well worn. I've had it for years. And another reason I love this cap is because it is just like my grandfather's cap. It's the same color and looked exactly like that. There's one distinct difference between my cap and my grandfather's, and that is I can take mine off. Because it seemed that my grandfather could not. He wore his cap day and night, night and day. He wore it to bed. He wore it when he was up in the morning. I only have one vivid memory of seeing him without his cap on. He was hair impaired like me, probably liked to keep his head warm, but there was only one vivid memory of seeing him without the cap, and that was one time when we were on vacation. Now, when I say we, there were a lot of we. There was Mary Ellen and Jerry, my parents, but then there was Dennis, Sean, Brian, Donald, Maureen, and Aaron. That always elicits some chuckles, but my dogs' names were Shaughnessy and Kelly. We were an Irish family. And so we went on this vacation once, and we all piled into the car. And when I say piled in, that meant that we had 3 in the front, 3 in the middle, 3 in the back, 2 dogs. So Mary Ellen and Jerry, Dennis, Sean, Brian, Donald, Maureen, Aaron, Grumpy Gramps, and the 2 dogs. We called him Grumpy Gramps because whenever he was awake, he was grumpy. And fortunately, he slept a lot. So I could tell you about that drive on vacation, but let's just fast forward and just say that we are from New York, drove over the bridge, Sagamore Bridge, onto Cape Cod. The first stop was to go to a motel, and that was to drop off Gramps, Grumpy Gramps, into the hotel, because I didn't mention that we were going camping. So 9 people in the car and the camping equipment, and that's why I could tell a story about the trip, but I won't. So we went to the hotel, and my mother and grandfather got out of the car and went to the front of the hotel, to the office, and within minutes they turned around and came back, and storming back and got in the car, and we were all saying, "What happened?" And Grumpy Gramps was saying, "Mosh slurth." These are the only 2 Gaelic words I know. I will not translate them. I heard it a lot. And we said, "What happened? What happened in there?" He said, "Well, I'm not paying that money. That's a highway robbery. For a few nights in a hotel, I can't believe they would charge that much." So what are you going to do? "Oh, he's going to come camping with us." So let's now transfer, and let's just get to the point where the campsite is set up. We don't have to go through, losing a child and finding the child, losing a dog, finding the dog, losing a grandfather, finding the grandfather, the rain coming down. We don't have to go. Another story, another day. So the campsite is set up, and now we have a big tent from Coleman Tent from Sears, Roebuck and Company. And then we had 4 sets of bunk cots, state of the art. So 4 bunk cots for 8 people. Now, with Gramps, that made 9. That meant that 2 of us would share a bunk, 2 of the younger kids, and Gramps had his own bunk. So I mentioned state of the art. There was another state of the art piece of camping equipment we had at the time, and that was called a portable toilet. Yes, we're going to go there. And you know, there's somewhat of a storyteller's creed. You can't be too gross, and I promise I won't be. But I'm going to be a little gross. So this portable toilet was a toilet seat, and it had legs going down like this, aluminum legs on both sides, and toilet seat, and it had a rubber band attaching this bag. So underneath. So I know many of you are just amazed and thinking back, and you're just thinking, how on earth can 9 people on this planet think that this is vacation? But this was our vacation. So we all have a pleasant night's sleep, and it's going to be morning, and the birds are chirping, and there's a little bit of streams of light coming through the seams of the tent, and all of a sudden, I hear this sound that's, and I said, that's not a bird. And that's not a bird. What is that? And then all of a sudden, kaplush. And we said, oh, what was that? And there's a few of us that woke up, and we looked down, and Cape Cod has ponds, but this happened to be a pond of yellow. But more importantly, there, for some reason, Gramps' cap was floating on the pond. Now, I want to back up, and it's not really right during storytelling to back up in your story, but let me back up for a second, because that sound, it's another version of the story. That sound, you know, I told it as the rubber band breaking on the portable toilet, but you know, the more I think about it, how did the 2 things end up there? So maybe, just maybe, that sound was the hat wrenching from my grandfather's head. And as it flew off his head, it hit the bag, and that's why the urine and hat ended up together. The first part, 2 versions, you can choose which one you believe. The first version doesn't explain why both things were down there, though. So as I said, a few of us woke up. It was just me, my younger brother, and my mother, and we said, oh my goodness. So my mother says, quick, grab some towels, let's mop this up. We'll go to the laundromat, and we'll go to Dunkin' Donuts. We'll bring back Dunkin' Donuts, and we'll just say we went out for Dunkin' Donuts. There are 2 things my parents knew the location of wherever we went on vacation, and one was the laundromat, and the other place was the emergency room. Sometimes we had to go to one, sometimes we had to go to the other, sometimes we had to go to both. So we went to the laundromat and cleaned things up. I went to Dunkin' Donuts, and we came back to the campsite. By the time we came back to the campsite, my father was up at the picnic table with the stove cooking up some coffee, and my grandfather was sitting with his back against the table, facing out from the picnic table with his arms folded and his bald head shining in the sun. So when my mother got out of the car, he immediately said, "Mary Ellen, where's my cap?" And so, well, Gramps, did you look in the tent? He said, "Yes, I looked in the tent." So my mother just went into the tent, and she yells from the tent, "Here it is!" And she came out with his cap, and said, he of course says, "Mushlerth," you know. And so he puts it on, and he says, "It's not fitting quite right. It feels a little snug." And we said, "Well, Gramps, it's the cool camping air. It's just kind of a little tight because of that." But he wore that cap the rest of his days, day and night and day, to bed, getting up in the morning. He always had the cap on. As far as me and my cap may go on vacation with me, but but I can tell you right now, it is never going camping. Thank you.
I always wondered what would happen if you got a doctor and a cap in the same story. Okay, so our next storyteller is Sharon Cohen. Sharon Perry Cohen has long been fascinated by cemeteries and those who inhabit them, both living and dead. Since she started contributing to Find a Grave in 2011, she has photographed most of the stones in Seaside and Locust Grove cemeteries and researched the lives of those buried in the City Home lot. And she will be here in 2 seconds to tell us more. Thank you, Sharon.
I think that's going to be okay. Is that okay? Closer. Closer. Whoa, I have to practically eat it. Okay. You could say that I raised the dead. I like to say I raised the dead. I belong to an online cemetery community called Find a Grave. 11 years ago, I was asked to photograph the grave of a woman named Minnie Dunbar at Seaside Cemetery. So I got a map from the cemetery department, found the grave, photographed it, put it up online, and then I took another look at the map. What I had always seen as a field with a smattering of stones at one end was densely populated with unmarked graves. It was a pauper's lot. Came as a shock to me, but it was a pauper's lot. Between 1905 and the late 1920s, this was the piece of ground in Gloucester where you ended up if you died in the almshouse, or if your body was unclaimed, or you were unnamed. There are 14 people that I know of in this piece of ground who don't have any identities beyond something like child found floating in the harbor. Yeah, so I made Find a Grave pages for every single one of them and posted them on Find a Grave. 7 years after that, a man contacted me, a Nova Scotian man, who was very excited because he had found his great-grandfather's grave on one of those pages. And we had a brief flurry of emails, and then I didn't hear from him for another 3 years. He contacted me this past spring to say that he and several other descendants of Ebenezer Devine were going to come to Gloucester and hold a memorial service for an ancestor who had died 107 years before. He just had one problem. The monument company would not place the stone he'd commissioned unless they had a more accurate idea of where Ebenezer was lying. So I took the map back to Seaside. I oriented myself to Minnie Dunbar. I paced out the 2.5 feet that was allotted to every pauper. And when I was relatively sure, actually I was very sure, that I was standing on top of the man, I drove in a stake with his name on it. A week later, when I returned to the cemetery, the stake had been replaced by a gorgeous piece of granite on which was written, Ebenezer Devine, I once was lost, but now am found. Yeah, got me right there too. As a direct result of that, I was approached by someone who happens to be here tonight, someone from the city's Cemetery Advisory Committee, who made me an offer I could not refuse. She suggested that we design a sign for the city to put on this piece of ground. And it wouldn't be just, a historic sign, here was a pauper's lot. She suggested that we find out who was buried here and put all of their names on the sign, so it would be a communal gravestone for everybody who didn't have one here. And she suggested that while I was doing the research for the sign, why didn't I go ahead and make little biographies for everybody? And if I did, she could turn that into a searchable database that she could link to the city's website. In the course of doing that research, This piece of ground became incredibly personal to me. I don't see an empty field anymore. When I go there, I see Sarah Boynton covered in ulcers from years of cocaine and morphine injections. She was dead by 26. And I see Hedvig Konsaloma, Finnish immigrant, servant, unmarried, pregnant, inhaled lighting gas. And I see the Sylvanen family, 3 of them, dead within 5 months. The father first of a gastric ulcer, the 18-year-old daughter of tuberculosis, and then her mother also of tuberculosis. There is tuberculosis all over this lot. Drownings, a surprising number of collisions by trains, alcoholism, suicides. This is a place where bad luck intersects with really bad decision-making. This is a grim story. I know how grim this is. And I'm going to end it where I started it with Minnie Dunbar. Minnie Dunbar was 32 when her husband was lost at sea, and she was 44 when she lay dying in the almshouse. Her daughter, Edith, 17 years old, got married 1 week before her mother succumbed to kidney disease. These biographies that I've written are as skeletal as the remains they represent, because I construct them only from what I can find in documents, and I do not color outside those lines. But I'm going to tell you something tonight that I cannot prove and will never be able to prove. But I believe in my heart to be true. Minnie Dunbar, until this summer, Minnie Dunbar had one of only 5 gravestones in a densely buried piece of ground the size of this theater. And it's the largest. It's about that tall, but it's larger than any of the others. And it's old. It wasn't placed there by a descendant who went on to have a more prosperous life. I believe it was put there by someone who knew Minnie Dunbar. Edith lived to be 95 years old, and she and her husband and her son are buried within sight of her mother's grave. I believe in my heart that Minnie Dunbar was loved not just to the last moment of her life, but to the last moment of her daughter's life. As for the rest of them, all of these people in this plot who I have grown to know just a little bit and care about enough, I would like to think they were all loved by somebody. Not just when they were young and filled with hope, but later, when it became perhaps problematic, when they were broken and lost to their addictions and their despairs. In the same way that I will always love those in my life who have been broken and lost to theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, for loving those people who we, until now, didn't even know existed. Thank you so much for doing that very fine research. That's some very delicate research. Okay, Aubry, that's a hard act to follow. But you're up to it. Okay, Aubry Threlkeld grew up in and around Charleston, South Carolina, and currently lives in Boston, MA, with their spouse Eric and 2 cats, Mia and Boris. Mia or Maya? Mia and Boris. They identify as a white person of Romani descent, queer and genderqueer. For the last 20 years, their work has been centered around advocating for people with disabilities in educational and healthcare settings. They grew up with their grandmother and mother speaking Anglo-Romani, playing cards and laughing whenever possible. Let's hear about it.
So it would be really easy for me to tell you a story about my Romani heritage and my grandmother, who was so meaningful to me, but I think I'm going to go a different direction. In 2006, my grandfather died of complications associated with Parkinson's disease, and I flew back to South Carolina, and my mother greeted me at the airport, and she said, "You have such a beautiful speaking voice. Will you give your grandfather's eulogy?" Well, you see, in 25 years of knowing my grandfather, we barely had a substantive conversation. We barely talked, and we had nothing in common. I mean, he was in World War II. I wasn't. He was a barber. I'm bald. And he loved working in the hot summer sun of South Carolina, and I'm more of an air conditioning type. And so I did what any grieving grandchild would do who is also a budding social scientist. I conducted an interview study of his nearest and dearest friends. And I started with my Uncle Bill, but eventually found my way back to my mother. And when I asked my mother to tell me a story that captured my grandfather, she said, "Well, your papa loved fishing, but no one would go fishing with him." And so she set out to go fishing with him. She stopped by a McDonald's and bought 2 sausage biscuits and a coffee, and arrived at the boat landing, presented him with the biscuits, which he quickly scarfed down, and drank the coffee. And she looked at him hungrily and was like, "I guess we're ready to go." And so she got in the boat, and he was backing the boat into the water, and she asked before the boat arrived in the water, "Dad, have you put the plug in the boat?" And he said, "Baby, I have been fishing for 50 years. I know what I'm doing." And as the boat got off the trailer, it started taking on water and started sinking right there in the landing. And my mother, desperately searching for the plug, while also partially attempting to bail water from the boat, is yelling for my grandfather to help, and he's trying to get out of the truck, and the boat partially sinks. They get help to drag it back on the trailer. They drain the boat, and then try to restart their voyage. As they get out on the water in the salt marsh, my mother looks up in the sky and sees some ominous clouds and says to my grandfather, "It looks like it's going to rain." And he says, "Baby, the wind's blowing the other direction. It's not going to rain. And if it does, it's going to pass us really quickly." And so they get to his favorite fishing spot. My mother starts casting her line, and she gets a bite. She catches a fish. She gets another bite. She catches another fish. And soon, my grandfather is casting over my mother, trying to catch a fish where my mother is fishing, right? My mother, afraid of a hook getting lodged in her face, moves to the other side of the boat. And around the same time, the wind starts to pick up through the sawgrass, through the spartina, and it starts to drizzle. And my mother says, "Maybe we should go back." And he says, "Baby, this is just what I told you. It's just going to rain a little bit. We're going to be okay." The deluge begins. It gets so wet so fast, they barely have time to put away the fishing equipment. And my grandfather, in all of his vainglorious self, gets behind the wheel of the boat, driving 50 miles an hour in a windstorm, trying to get back to the boat landing. The boat is launching itself into the air 6 feet, crashing into the waves. My mother is simultaneously whipped by the wind with the rain stinging her face and wants to vomit at the same time. And they arrive at the landing, and the rain stops. And my grandfather looks at my mother and says, "See, I told you. It was going to stop." My mother never went fishing with my grandfather ever again. But these were the kinds of stories I kept collecting. And I had to give a eulogy in just a few short days. So I mustered up the courage to stand at the lectern, and I shared some of these stories just as they were told to me, and everyone in the room, my family, friends, all gathered, laughed, and cried. And I meekly stepped away from the podium, and my two big burly uncles wrapped their arms around me, and they said, "Nobody's ever described my father more accurately." And so maybe we do have some things in common. We're both overconfident, but we both really loved our families.
It wouldn't be an ancestor evening without at least one impossible grandfather. So thank you, Aubry, for bringing us that impossible fellow. Okay, Sara Allen. Sarah Johnson Allen was raised mostly in North Carolina. We've got some southern accent tonight. Her debut novel, Down Here We Come Up, is the winner of the 2022 Big Moose Prize and is forthcoming from Black Lawrence Press in August 2023. She has been, She has been awarded the Marianne Russo Award for Emerging Writers by the Key West Literary Seminar, the Stockholm Writers Festival First Pages Prize, McDowell Fellowships, and an artistic grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation. So I think we're lucky to have her here. When do you get the time? Come on up, my dear. Tell us a story.
Okay. So my father has several guns, but the one that I want, he won't give to me. By all rights of Southern tradition of inheritance, it should go to my younger brother. But my brother, he doesn't believe in guns. He said, "Fine, I'll take the gun, but you have to disable it." That would destroy it, which broke my father's heart when he said that. Before it was my father's gun, it was my grandfather's gun. He used it to supplement his income as a tobacco farmer in eastern North Carolina. In the winter, he was a hunting guide for rich clients who wanted to go quail hunting and drink bourbon. It was one of those rich clients who would really change the trajectory of our family's life forever. My grandfather died suddenly at 50 of a massive heart attack at the height of the tobacco season. My father was 19 and home from his freshman year at the local Bible college. He says he doesn't really remember that summer. He wishes he could. All he remembers is he knew he had to get the tobacco in to keep the farm afloat. There's certainly no money to go back to college. But then my father got a phone call, and it said, come back to campus. And when he got back, he found out that one of my grandfather's rich hunting clients had paid his tuition. And he paid his tuition for the next 3 years. So my father finished college, and he never returned to the land that his father farmed. Part of that land is still in our family. A couple generations of my cousins live there, my elderly uncle, and until she died last year, my aunt. Someone else lives there too, someone my age named Will, who came from Mexico as a migrant worker in the mid-1990s. He has his own family now, and if I'm being honest, he's more a member of that part of my family than I have ever been. Back when I was in college, I went to go visit my aunt and uncle. And my aunt called me back to her bedroom, which is where she usually was at this time. It was down this long hall. And I went down the hall, and she was lying in bed, and Will was sitting in a chair, like a kitchen chair, next to her bed, and he looked really uncomfortable. And I stood in the doorway, and she explained to me why she was going to give Will $2,000 to buy a new truck. Now, my aunt was really high on painkillers. The entire region was awash with them at that time. First Percocet and Vicodin, and later OxyContin. But before any of us knew the Sackler name, I stood in the doorway, a college girl, looking at my aunt, trying to justify something I knew was none of my business. Will worked the farm, and he continued to work the farm for the next 20 years. He saved the farm. But then when my uncle had to sell some of the land for money, Will was not in line to buy it. He couldn't. So me and Will were looking at each other. And we're looking at each other like, whose family is this anyway? Because does the family belong to the people with the bloodlines? I look exactly like my aunt. Or does the family look like the people, does the family belong to the people who take care of the elderly and the sick and the addicted? Does the land belong to the people whose family lived on it for generations? Or does the land belong to the people who live on it now? And if you leave the land, do you have any claim to any of it? And what about the gun? Over Thanksgiving, the gun came up again. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Let's see, I think I missed something. So I was wondering about who owns the family, and I was wondering about who the land belongs to. And I wonder about the gun, because should the gun go to the firstborn or the firstborn son? Should the gun go to the one who wants to hunt with the best aim, or the one who's actually willing to pull the trigger? And it did come up over Thanksgiving. My whole family was together. It was my father and my brother and I talking about the gun. And, oh my gosh, I forgot again. Okay, we were talking about it. We were kind of arguing about it. And my brother said, if she wants the gun, give it to her. And my dad, still hurt, said, when you said you would disable the gun, you lost me. So the interesting thing is my father also said something else. He said, I always thought that gun would go to a Johnson. It took me like a minute to even know what he meant, because that's my maiden name. I was thinking, yeah, blood, firstborn, like this, I'm a Johnson. But then I realized that's not what he meant. I'm an Allen now, and even my firstborn son isn't in line for that gun. Meanwhile, my second-born son heard this whole conversation. Now, he's a middle child, and all middle children know there is no inheritance coming for them. Unless it's charisma, charm, political savvy, that they have. And so my middle son listened to all of this, and later he said, Mom, it's obvious the gun is supposed to go to you, but do you even want it? And I thought about that. And you know what? I'm not sure I do want something that no one wants me to have. I think maybe when the inheritance is not coming to you because of gender or citizenship or name, you have to forge your own kind of firearm. I think you have to find a different, new way to fight. Thank you for everything.
When Sarah first told me about that story, actually, she told the whole Storytellers workshop, she said, so I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but my first line is, my father won't give me the gun. So it is a fabulous story now. So do we know what's going to happen to the gun?
No, but the ancestor just watched, so I'm nervous.
Okay. Okay, our final storyteller of the evening is Layla Goodman, who has long been associated with Fishtails, with Gloucester Writers' Centre, and with Gloucester generally. I wouldn't be here without Layla. Layla brought me to this position as storyteller-in-residence, golly, almost a year to the day, I think. I remember the feeling of standing under these lights for the first time. And so it's only fitting that Layla stories us out tonight. So most of you probably know Layla, but I'll just bring you up to speed. Layla is a biology teacher, doula, and magician. She is a magician. I know, it's astonishing. Her storytelling is a necessary practice to explain the many chapters of her life, growing up with a magician father. Of course she's a magician. She has a magician father. To riding horses with urban cowboys in South Florida, to being a spiritual advisor at a Jewish high school in Boston. She lives in Magnolia in a house that her husband's grandfather bought in 1934. So, I mean, there are ancestors right there. Layla, come on up.
Yeah, it's not in the story, but my dad always claimed the two sets of twins was his magic wand, but really it was my mother's ovaries. It'll echo. I met my husband. It feels a little echoey. Is that okay? I met my husband in my late 20s, and we were married a year and a month later and had 2 kids in the next 4 years. So it was a whirlwind of time. We didn't make much money, and we worked split shifts so that we could minimize the need for childcare. My husband worked nights on the weekends, and it was just us worried about money, worried about just how to raise these beings. And of course, there were toddler temper tantrums. I remember once my son, Reeve, when he was about 2.5, had just totally lost it, was flipping out. He had flung himself at the bottom of the stairs, screaming, kicking, crying. I stood there and watched him, and I thought about all the times in my life when I'd felt exactly the same way. My mother got married at 20. She was forced to drop out of college, as was the custom in those days, to help put my dad finish school. And my parents had 2 sets of twins by the time my mom was 25, 2 boys, 2 girls, 2 years and 2 months apart. My mom was responsible for all the childcare, all the cooking, all the cleaning, while my dad gallivanted around town chasing one woman or another, and another. She yelled a lot. Anger was the chief emotion allowed in my family, but it was mostly awarded to the loudest and most rageful, which wasn't usually me. There were physical fights too. My brother beat up his twin brother pretty much every single day. And there were objects thrown, coconuts, horseshoes, knives even, and once even I was thrown into a second-story window. There was love too, but anger and rage were part of the daily menu. My mother's comfort zone was, still is, a clean house, an immaculate house. Once a plumber working on my mom's toilet looked up and said, "Lady, I've been a plumber for 25 years. I've never seen a bathroom this clean. I would eat my lunch in here." Most of my mom's rages at us were about messes we made by simply living. My grandmother, my mother's mother, my grandma Ida, didn't really care much for house cleaning, preferring instead to cook large meals for the many guests and listen to opera. My mother has not one bad word to say about her mother, except she had a messy house. My grandma Ida died when I was 6, so the memories are few but potent. I remember a laundry basket filled with toys in the spare room, her feeding me ice cream for breakfast, butter pecan, still my favorite, her sharing a cheese Danish with me every Sunday brunch, and her large-breasted body holding me in warm, safe, loving hugs. The last time I saw my grandmother, she was in a hospital bed in the living room a few days before she died. She had suffered a stroke, so she couldn't speak and she couldn't move, but I can still feel her loving gaze on me. So there I was, staring at this being lost in this wild maelstrom of feelings. And I was surprised to discover this well of love. I can't tell you why it skipped a generation, but I was able to just make space for all the feelings my son was having at that moment. And in making space for him, I made space for my 2-year-old self, my 6-year-old self, my 13-year-old self, all the selves that had felt sad, lost, bad, and ashamed. In healing, in parenting my children, I healed myself. I sat down on the stairs and I said in a loving, warm voice, "It's really hard to have a lot of feelings. It's okay, I'm right here." Eventually the storm subsided and he inched closer until he was snuggling right up against me. I wrapped my arms around him, still vibrating with Grandma Ida's love, extending now to the great-grandson she had never known.
What a wonderful evening of stories. Our storytellers have been tremendously generous. They have given us stories that belong to them. They have given us stories that come from very private parts of their lives. It's a real privilege to hear these stories tonight. So can we please just thank all our storytellers? Thank you. Okay, so here it is. It's my last time under these fabulous lights. I'm a bit sad. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be up here. When Layla contacted me a year ago and said, "Would you like to be the next storyteller in residence?" I asked her a million questions. Mostly, I thought, I am never going to be able to persuade people to tell stories publicly. It's terrifying. Why would they do that? And Layla said to me, "That is not the problem. It's getting them to give you their biographies and their headshots. That's the problem." And she was right. But over the past year, I did manage to get 4 shows worth of storytellers and bring them all together to tell their fabulous stories. And it has been tremendously enriching. And this is a tradition that I now pass on to Heidi. So Heidi, could you come up here for 2 seconds? Hold on to my bit of paper. I'll be right back. Okay.
Could I just have all the storytellers come on up behind me, please? Thanks.
This is the Fishtails fish hook, which was crafted specially for fishtails. It belongs to fishtails. It's a fabulous, beautiful thing. I've had it in my office at Endicott College for the past year. I've never once explained it. It's sat there without any kind of context or explanation. I'm loath to give it up because the first thing you want to do is this. And I can't do that anymore. But Heidi, it is now yours.
Thank you. I never thought I'd want to get the hook, but especially at a storyteller event. Thank you all so much here at Gloucester Stage Company. Thank you at the Gloucester Writers Center. Special thank you to Adam Tessier and Jennifer Banks. I believe it's your correct last name. Thank you to Gabrielle Watling, and thank you to these amazing storytellers behind us. Can we please give them a round of applause? I was here a year ago, and I saw Layla announce the new storyteller-in-residence, and I said, I want to do that. So be careful what you wish for, because things do come true, and I really do believe in the power of making things happen. So we're excited to announce our 2 next storytelling events. So if this is something you are interested in, we are a welcoming, inclusive stage, and we really want to hear your stories. Our first theme is Fools on March 31st, April Fool's Eve, and our second theme is Mothers on May 12th. So there's lots of stories in there. I can hear and see the brains already working. And if you are a newcomer, we do have storytelling support. So if this is something that you have never done before, there are some newcomers here on the stage tonight. And maybe you can pick them out, maybe you can't. But there are also veterans, so do not let that keep you from speaking to me or reaching out to be a part of this wonderful local program. So if there's no other comments or questions, I thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Big things to break down fast and nothing to last.